Hello, this is Alan Wheeler on my YouTube channel where I have been talking about spirituality and the tarot. And today I intended to let the Morgan Greer tarot help to interpret or apply the legend of the Grail, starring Percival. In addition, I took 3 cards out that, to my mind, kind of covered the story of the Grail, and I drew an Oham stick with an Oham symbol as well. And a card fell out while I was shuffling the Morgan Greer tarot. So let me start and then try to quickly tell the story before looking at the 3 cards that I drew from the Morgan Greer tarot. Now, the card that fell out was the 5 of Pentacles, and I thought it was very fortuitous, a kind of synchronicity that the story involves healing, and that this big pentacle we see in the background is sometimes associated with Gawain in some versions of the legend. And as well, the Jungian interpretation of the story involves stages of developing with the anima and in a way, the goddess or the mother heart of the soul. And so this card was very appropriate and kind of works as a good frame for the reading to come. The Oham symbol that I drew was willow. I think it's pronounced, I don't know the pronunciation quite, but it's Sale, I think, Saile. And the willow often stands also for the feminine energy, that moon, that water, and that mystery that's associated with the willow as well. So this provides a really good frame for the story. The cards that I pulled from the Smith-Waite Tarot, the Centennial Edition, to kind of show the stages of the story, were the Fool, in which Percival begins as a novice, and he has that adventuresome fool energy about him. Through the story, he grows up and has many victories and kind of develops that chariot energy. And finally, a card to represent the Grail itself, the kind of the culmination and climax of the story, I picked the Ace of Cups. And the Grail, or the Ace of Cups, can be looked at many ways, but one way is the Grail as kind of the symbol of God's grace to humanity. It could also be looked at as the connection with the anima mundi and that kind of flowing of source and spirit, or from a psychological perspective, in the Jungian interpretation I mentioned, that integration of the anima and kind of that development of the soul and psyche. So with those uh, frameworks in place, let me try to run quickly through the Grail myth. Now, Percival, as a young man, his father uh, was killed as a knight, but his mother sheltered him, and he never saw a knight, and never knew about this until uh, one day, as a teenager, he does chance upon a knight, sees the shining armor, thinks that this must be an angel, and uh, longs to become a knight himself, much to his mother's chagrin. So he won't be thwarted in his desires. So uh, finally, his mother instructs him in what she knows. She tells him he must pray in a chapel, which he's never seen before. He must understand the honor um, that's bestowed if a maiden kisses him or gives him a ring, and so on. And he doesn't really understand, he doesn't have the experience to understand these instructions. Um, so he leaves wearing his mother's uh, nightshirt. As he goes on his way, his mother faints, and he continues on, um, leaving her in her terror, so to speak, and fear. Kind of as this foolish character, he sees a tent and mistakes it for a chapel, and he barges in. He uh, sees a maiden there, and misconstruing his mother's instructions, he forces a kiss on the maiden and swipes a ring from her. And uh, when the partner returns home, the returning man is haughty and angry and longs for revenge, although he doesn't find Parsifal. Parsifal goes on in the energy of the fool to King Arthur's court, where he requests to become a knight, and he's mocked at the round table, although Arthur seems to listen to him, and but the knights mock him. Sir Kay jokes that he should take the armor from the Red Knight. Now, the Red Knight, I believe it's annually, he comes and throws the cup of Queen Guinevere's wine in her face, and none of the knights are able to defend her honor against this uh, Red Knight. So, not knowing, not realizing that Sir Kay was mocking, Parsifal heads out, finds the Red Knight, and tells him that under King Arthur's orders, he is to give him his armor. And when the fight ensues, the first of many victories fall to Parsifal, and he puts the armor on over his mother's nightshirt. He continues on his adventures, and it's in the energy of the chariot now, perhaps more than the fool, as he wins fight after fight, and he sends uh, the losers back to King Arthur's court under the sworn as prisoners and swearing fealty, and they one by one go back to King Arthur's court, and they are granted knighthood there. And so actually the kind of the organized court there at Camelot is expanding and growing from his wild adventures here as the story goes on. Uh, Evidently, at some point, he does take off the mother's nightshirt. He learns not to ask foolish questions and talk too much and other things, apparently. Um, when he comes upon the Grail castle, an enchanted, otherworldly castle where he's strangely welcomed in, and he uh, is invited to a great feast where periodically a bleeding spear and a grail are paraded before him. But perhaps having grown up too much and having lost that dynamic energy of the fool, that impulsive access to his inner nature and intuition, perhaps, he fails to ask the healing question, um, which he needs to ask in order for the king to be healed here. And when he leaves the uh, castle, he can't get back in. He's locked out. No amount of yelling will allow him back in, but he encounters, I think it's by the river perhaps, where he actually sees the wounded fisherman fishing daily, and he learns from a woman he meets who is his cousin that this is indeed his uncle, and he learns the story of how the king, how this is his king, the uncle, how he was wounded, and how it's needed that the healing question be asked um, to bring about his healing. Now, the backstory that he learns is that when the king was a young knight and out um, on his impulsive journeys seeking love and adventure, um, he chanced upon a Mohammedan pagan, and the unlike the Christian knight who was out on a sensuous quest, the Mohammedan was searching for the cross. And when they meet, like good knights, they battle. The lance of who will be the king kills the pagan, and the spear of the pagan wounds the thigh, or basically castrates probably the uh, the king, making him the wounded king who becomes the Fisher King. So after at this point, there's many different versions of the story, different continuations, and in some of them, Gawain, um, who's the heir of Parsifal, um, fulfills the quest of the Grail, and in some of them, Galahad, um, who is not only has the chivalry of Gawain, but has the holiness required. Um, but in my favorite version, actually, Parsifal grows up and returns, and with that reintegrated, perhaps that full energy, is able to come into the enchanted castle and ask the healing question and fulfill the initial mission, kind of coming to that third stage of accessing the grace um, that his victory and his pride had limited earlier. And so, because the king's health is tied to the health of the realm, the wasteland, the barren wasteland, is restored, and so the card that fell out um, seems to come into play as that spiritual healing is enacted, the five being associated with the Hierophant and depicted very appropriately in the Morgan Greer Tarot as this comfort to the wounded figure here. Now, in closing, here are the cards that I drew from the three cards that I drew randomly from the Morgan Greer Tarot, and I'll just close out with this reflection for maybe how to apply this again. And I drew the Queen of Pentacles first, and so this again reminded me of the three stages, kind of the integration of the anima and the in the beginning of the story, it being the physical mother who is full of fear and who gives Parsifal the nightshirt, but then becomes a woman at the Grail castle. And in some versions of the story, there's actually a woman within the castle who acts as a kind of inspiration or muse, so that it's kind of a higher level of that feminine energy. And then, of course, in the end, the stage three, the more spiritual healing energy and wisdom depicted in the Grail itself. So that kind of picture of Mother Earth, again, gives that focus for the story. And then, randomly, the Chariot also came up. So the very card that I had picked with my logical mind came up randomly. But again, it spoke to me of the kind of pride of life that comes along with all this development and all these victories. And it's I'm always interested in how the Tower card, number 16, I believe, if those digits are added, as in numerology, 1 plus 6 is 7, and how the Tower is kind of the flip side of the pride and victory of the Chariot, and how that has to come crumbling down for the real progress, for the level 3 progress to be made. And finally, the 7 of Cups, and this reminds me of that liminal space that Parsifal enters, where he's not the fool of the novice in kind of in that true foolishness, but yet that's required at stage 1. But he's in this liminal space where he has to access the feminine energy that we saw in the willow Ohem symbol, that magical, mystical, that intuition, and that energy of the Fool in that liminal space that allows him to re-enter the castle and ask the healing question. And so there are many interpretations of that. There could be a Christian interpretation. There can be a more a pagan or earth-based interpretation of this story, but perhaps they work together in some ways here. So I will stop here, but thank you for watching, and as always, I hope you will find connection in real life, in online community, and on your spiritual path, uh, whatever that might be. Take care.